All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and made possible by listeners and supporters like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. If you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the other great shows in our network. And please support the work that we're doing here at Working People so that we can keep growing and keep bringing you more important conversations. And you can support us by leaving us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And of course, by sharing these episodes on your social media and sharing them with your coworkers, your friends, and family members. And of course, the single best thing that you can do to support our work is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. And if you subscribe for $10 a month, you'll also get a print subscription to the amazing In These Times magazine delivered to your mailbox every month. Just head on over to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you will immediately get access to all of the awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published for our amazing subscribers over the years. We just published a great bonus episode with the amazing journalist Lauren Kaori-Gurley from Vice's Motherboard and Luis Feliz Leon from Labor Notes about the truly incredible Amazon labor union victory in Staten Island last week. And we've got another bonus episode coming this week with union organizer and historian of capitalism, Eric Baker. So you guys don't want to miss out on those. So become a subscriber and help us keep growing, help the show keep going. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and we've got a very, 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 very special episode for y'all today. Yes, every episode we do is special. Every conversation that we have on this show is special. And the conversation that we've got for you guys today is definitely a doozy. But this is also a special episode for the show and for me. If you happen to look at the episode number on your podcast player, then you know that this is our 200th episode. Well, okay, so technically it's our 201st episode, but I put a big underline under that but. If you recall, when we posted the episode that probably got more listeners pissed off than any other episode, and they got pissed off because we played leaked audio clips from union-busting captive audience meetings at the vegan meat company No Evil Foods. So when we posted that, No Evil Foods tried to get our episode taken down. So we actually published a second version of that episode without the leaked audio while we were working to get the original one restored, which we eventually did. So both versions of that episode are still on the main feed right now. So I'm counting them as one, which means this is the 200th episode of Working People. Holy shit, man. 200 episodes. I mean, just so many amazing conversations with workers about their lives, jobs, their dreams, and their struggles. So many amazing conversations, so many strikes and organizing efforts and stories of struggle and victory and pain and love and loss. So many cherished memories that have been shared with us and our listeners. And God, I mean, so much of myself that I've poured into all of these conversations as well. I accepted it a long time ago that working people would never be a big podcast. That we were never going to get glossy profiles in, New York magazines. And, even as we've grown in listeners, we've really always only barely scraped by with the meager amount of money that we get from Patreon. It's just the reality. But, it has truly been one of the great honors of my life to offer this platform to so many who have felt so unheard for so long. And, I hope that it's made a difference, however small. And, it's really hard to sum up how it feels to look back over the past 5 seasons, to see that first episode with my dad, Jesus, to see all the names of all the incredible people who were willing to share their story with some guy most of them had never met before, and to share, with an audience of listeners that they would probably never meet. This show has changed quite a bit over the years, and I like to think that all of those changes have been for the better. But, in many ways, the core of this project has stayed the same. And so to commemorate 200 episodes of this rinky-dink podcast that I started as a graduate student with rented equipment, it only seems fitting to read this passage from a 2018 article that I wrote in Current Affairs called "Can the Working Class Speak?", where I tried to explain why I started the show in the first place and why listening to one another, really listening, is, as I see it, one of the greatest and even revolutionary gifts that we can give to our fellow workers. Quote, "The concept behind working people is incredibly simple. I talk to working class folks from around the country, from all walks of life, and I record it. We talk about their life stories. We talk about where they grew up. We talk about family, friends, school, politics, and whatever else comes up. And we talk about their working lives, their dreams, their victories, and their struggles. I'd be lying if I said that deep, scorching need for some kind of human connection that led me to start the podcast wasn't also intertwined with the underlying political aim of building a sense of shared struggle and solidarity among workers. And the inspiration for this, once again, came from a familiar source. As all of us in our family slogged onwards in an endless, arduous struggle just to get by, my dad took a job driving for Uber on nights and weekends. And it broke my heart. Knowing more than enough about Uber's slimy, exploitative, low-paying model, it broke my heart to see him, like so many others, being taken advantage of. But something happened that I hadn't expected. Pops found something he desperately needed. Something that I think gave him the courage to share his story with me on the podcast. Something that had been entirely absent in every other area of his life. While working as an Uber driver, he simply started talking to people. To the immigrant nurse he was driving to her second job. To the middle-aged husband who had lost everything in the recession and had nothing for retirement. He discovered intimacy and honesty and solidarity with strangers, with fellow workers. And in talking to them, he began to learn that he wasn't alone. For the overwhelming majority of us, to live in the United States is to bask in a world that's simply not ours, to be consumed by desires for what we don't have, to strive to be what we are not, to be told again and again that who we are is not good enough. We are inundated by an endless kaleidoscopic barrage of elite lives and elite tastes, serving as a daily reminder to working people that the blood and sinew of our rich, complex lives will always count for less. And it compounds that unshakable, shameful feeling that we carry with us, the feeling that we're the only ones going through this, that other people are getting by just fine, that our misery is our failure and ours alone. But at a time when so few control so much, there's a world-changing potential in seeing ourselves and our neighbors as people engaged in a shared struggle, as so many strive to make do on so little. There's healing in knowing we're not alone in this. There's beauty and strength in sharing our stories and our scars with each other. And our stories do deserve to be told. Our struggles deserve to be remembered. Our lives deserve to be celebrated. End quote. So that pretty much sums it up. You know, that's what this show has always been about, and that's what will continue to be about. And today's episode is no exception. Now, I specifically wanted to hold this conversation until we hit the 200 episode mark, because first, it's just a really phenomenal conversation that I think is like worthy of that 200 episode celebratory place. But second, you know, this episode reminds me of what I always wanted the show to be when I first started out. You know, if you guys have gone back to listen to the episodes in season 1, then you know that those were like, 2 to 2.5 hour long episodes where I had, much more sprawling conversations with workers about their life stories. And, if I had my way, and if it wasn't such a big burden to put on listeners, every regular season episode of this show would be that long. So, I guess thank God that I don't have my way. But, this episode is actually part of our special series of conversations with teachers, organizers, scholars, and activists in Wisconsin that I recorded this past summer as part of a special collaboration between the Real News Network and In These Times magazine for the Wisconsin Idea, a limited independent reporting project created by People's Action Institute, Citizen Action of Wisconsin, and In These Times. But out of all the interviews that I did while I was in Wisconsin with Cameron Granadino from The Real News and Hannah Faris from In These Times, this was the only one where I asked them if they could just sit with me and let the conversation go for as long as it needed to. And I am so glad that they obliged me as I got to have this expansive and, life-altering conversation with Susan Simensky Bietila in Milwaukee. It's impossible to sum up here who Sue is, what an amazing life she's lived. And so I'm going to let the conversation do that. But, we went to Sue's home to talk for the series on the long and coordinated assault on teachers and public sector unions in Wisconsin, because Sue had worked as a school nurse in Wisconsin and was deeply involved in the Wisconsin Uprising, the massive protest that took place around the state in 2011 in response to Act 10, which was being pushed by Republican Governor Scott Walker. And those protests really centered on the Capitol in Madison. And, Sue even produced some of the iconic artworks and posters that have, come to visually define that moment, because she is also a lifelong artist and activist. And we talk all about that. We talk about, her relatives fleeing the pogroms in what is now Ukraine a century ago. We talk about growing up in the projects in New York. We talk about being an artist and pursuing a career in art at a time when women just weren't allowed to do that. And, Sue is very much a barrier breaker in this respect and in many others. We also talk about all the creative and incredible ways that Sue has brought art to so many vital political struggles, and she's touched so many lives with her art. And, we also talk about how she got into nursing, how she made her way to Wisconsin, how she ended up at the protests in Madison over a decade ago. I mean, what can I say? She's lived an incredible life. And I am just so grateful that I got a chance to know her and that she was willing to share her story with me. And, of course, I got to give a special thanks to my boy, John Fleissner, a brilliant artist, activist, and educator in his own right, for connecting me with Sue for this project. And thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone who has made this show what it is over the past 200 episodes. Thank you to Jules for coming on as our producer in season 4 and making the show just infinitely better. Thank you to every single person who has ever given us their time and attention to listen to these important stories. Thank you to all of the friends and family who have loved and encouraged me throughout all of this. And, above all else, thank you to every beautiful person who has ever trusted us enough to come on the show and share their stories with us so openly and vulnerably. And that very much includes today's guest, Susan Simensky Bietila. This is her story.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Susan Simensky Bietila, and I'm just going to be 74 coming up next week. And I've been an RN for 49 years and activist artist for even longer. And I've done 2 careers simultaneously. And welcome to my home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah. Well, Sue, thank you so much for welcoming us here. And yeah, I could not be more excited to talk to you about your life and your work. As you said, you've been a registered nurse for many years, but also an artist and an activist. And, we were talking about this before we got recording, is that in many ways that goes deep in your blood, deep into your family history. So could we, I guess, kind of go back to the beginning and kind of talk about some of that sort of family history, like, and how you, I suppose, ended up getting kind of becoming involved in politics and art?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My mother's side of the family were refugees from pogroms in what is now the Ukraine. Back then it was called Bessarabia. And they fled, being chased pretty much out by Cossacks, the Tsar's white armies, during the Civil War after the Russian Revolution. And we learned that the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. Well, the Civil War continued until 1924. And when the Red Armies were victorious, the racist, reactionary Tsarist armies were driven into the southwest part of the Ukraine, which is where Jews were forced to live. So the tragedies happened one after the other and were particularly bad in 1919 and 1921, where there were massacres and people driven from their homes. So they took off in 1921. They just started walking after the Cossacks almost killed my grandfather. So they had relatives in New York and were able, it took them a year to get permission to come to the U.S. And they came in the middle of the height of the anti-immigrant frenzy in the U.S. 1921 is the first time they had quotas against immigrants from various parts of the world to keep racial undesirables out. And those included Eastern Europeans, Jews, Italians, who were pretty much in the spotlight because after the Russian Revolution, the U.S. was worried that agitators would be coming in. And you can read all about that. It was a very interesting period in history. So they came to the U.S. and were a group that was very poor. Family members were in the garment trades, and strangely enough, the garment trades were union organized by Reds. The Furriers Union was a Red union. A bunch of the different garment unions were organized by communists and leftists of different kinds. The neighborhood I grew up in, at first, we lived with my grandparents, and they, at that point, had a corner store, like many of the corner stores we have today, who were run by immigrants, and so they had food during the Depression. They didn't have money, but they had enough to eat. And just for a little bit of local color, when they arrived in the U.S., there had been famine in the Ukraine. There was war going on all these years. There was World War I and then the Russian Revolution, and people had very little to eat. So my grandparents put my mother and her older sister out on the fire escape and fed them. They weren't allowed to run around. They just had to be fed up until they reached something like a normal weight. They came from, they grew some of their own crops. And what my grandfather did in the old country was he sold tobacco out of a little shed next to the house. He was never a businessman, to my grandmother's great disappointment, and they just worked, 18 hours a day in this little corner store. Aspirations of the streets being paved with gold in America did not happen for my family. I grew up in government housing because there was a housing shortage after World War II. And first they housed families of the returning soldiers in the Quonset huts, the military barracks, which were built on the outskirts of New York boroughs. And then they built some of the first high-rise housing projects. So when you think of growing up in the projects, they were new. They were new. They were landscaped. They were not what you think about, like when you think of Cabrini Green, et cetera, and the other housing projects and what they've become in New York now. And so it was a very happy place for me, despite people being refugees from one tragedy after another, because it was all GI's kids. So there was a tremendous number of children my age, and parents very eager for their children to become educated, which they saw as the way into mainstream American society. Although we spoke Yiddish at home, I was discouraged from speaking anything but English, like many immigrant groups, because it's like, you're the American baby. You have to be American now.
Honestly, I had a similar experience. Like my dad, Jesus, God bless him, I give him shit for it now, but we were not raised to really speak Spanish. Like a lot of Chicanos, we would have our family, our extended family speak to us in Spanish, and we would respond in English.
Exactly, yeah. So I'd understand Yiddish perfectly. and then, respond in English. And I can still understand what the majority of what people are saying.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in the projects. I excelled in art at a very young age, and won a scholarship to art school out of first or second grade. My teacher had the opportunity to pick someone, and so I traveled on the New York subway alone at age 7 or so to the Brooklyn Museum Art School. And back then, it was like people did that. The kids would be, at an early age, you'd go shopping. I'd go shopping to push carts with my little basket on my bike and buy fresh fruits and vegetables. Children were playing in the street. It was a safe kind of thing to do.
Mm-hmm. When you say that, so what was if you can recall the memory, did your teacher in first or second grade just see something that you'd drawn and say we need to get this kid, we need to get this kid out of here? Or what?
Well, I did very well at school, and I'd finish my schoolwork really fast. Mm. And then there was an easel in the back of the room, and if you finished your work quickly, you could go paint at the easel. Mm. So it was pretty apparent. And then my mother had taken me to visit real artists who lived in the projects. And she took me to visit an African-American man who was a painter when I was 5. Mm-hmm. And we spent time with him and watched, he showed us his paintings. And museums were free, so I got taken to museums a lot. So I was very aware of art. And then in second grade, I won something called the School Art League Award, which was a citywide competition for National Brotherhood Week from the UN. So I won in competition with all of the kids in New York. And so it was I was pushed to be an artist. I was encouraged. There was never any thought to how I'd actually make a living. Mm. Never a thought. It's just, you're talented, this is your talent. And so that's remained with me. And I went to the High School of Music and Art in New York, which is very competitive to get into. Mm-hmm. And traveled 1 hour and 3/4 each way on the subway to get to high school, which was pretty hellacious.
Yeah.
But it took me out of the ghetto mentality, the ghetto neighborhood cultural niche, because lots of people in my neighborhood never left. Mm-hmm. The kids didn't go into Manhattan. They didn't explore. When I went to high school, I used to get off at a different subway stop on the way home every time and see what was there, and just wander around New York City and see the different districts, the jewelry district, the flower district, the garment district, the way the houses looked, what kind of people lived in different places. And the curiosity and the interest in people and different cultures has remained with me. Mm-hmm.
Was there, I guess for folks who have never experienced that, I'm curious just if you could kind of talk a little more about what New York City looked like at that time and how it's changed. Because, I go now and I see my sister who was going to college there, and I don't know, it just feels like people, when I go there now, people say, oh, New York's nothing like it was in the 80s and the 90s. But then I know people in the 80s and 90s say, oh, New York's nothing like it was in the 50s and the 60s. So I guess what was it like for you as a little kid who grew up in the projects, wandering around those streets on your own?
I wasn't aware of it at the time because I was a child, but the people who were there, all being World War II veterans and mostly being Jewish, although not everybody was, and having, observed the Holocaust firsthand, many of them, they were very critical of the world situation. They're very suspicious of capitalism and the contests between the different world powers. And coming from Europe, they were socialists, communists, anarchists, Bundists, people who were a lot of people on the left, not everybody, and very, very few Zionists. There was one Zionist out of all the families in our building. Most of the Jewish people were not religious, agnostic. There were people who were Orthodox, but they were in a great minority. And people had aspirations. People took my father went to a night class and built a little television set that had like a 8-inch screen, 9-inch screen, round. And the picture came in upside down when he built it. And so I stood with my back toward the TV, bent at the waist, and looked through my legs to look at it watch it upside down. So yeah, I remember that. I mean, and other people took like camera repair courses. A lot of people went to school on the GI Bill. Mm-hmm. And that's when the colleges, like the city colleges of New York, expanded tremendously because there were a lot of people returning from the war who had funding to go to school. Mm. And they worked during the day at blue-collar jobs, and they went to school at night. And so a lot of people, the people who made it in my neighborhood, I thought teachers were the rich people. Mm. I really did. And we'll be talking more about teachers later.
Right.
But the teachers, they didn't live in the projects. They lived in houses that had a front yard. They lived in a house that was separate from the other houses. And that was like, for living in New York City, that was as high as aspiration as I could imagine when I was a child. And yet I'd go to the museums and I'd see the houses on Park Avenue and the fancy stores on Fifth Avenue, and it was like beyond my comprehension.
Right.
And I'd watch TV shows like Ozzie and Harriet and other families who lived in suburbs, and it was just as unreal as like The Wizard of Oz to me. I just didn't. I had never visited anybody who lived in their own private house. People lived in apartment houses.
Yeah.
And people didn't have cars when I was a child. Not many people had cars. My dad bought a car finally in 1952, and it was his prize because nobody had cars.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that kind of upward aspiration, one thing he said that really struck me, because I mean I think it's great, and it just made me really kind of sad to think how different it is now.
Yeah.
As also a child of immigrants who I think my parents were very supportive, and I love them for that. But there was never even a chance for us or others in our generation to think about what skills we wanted to develop beyond, like, without connecting that to how are you going to make a living out of it.
Right.
So, like, I loved art as a kid. I loved literature, but it was always nothing more than a hobby to me, because I just knew that, like, there was no way to make a living. So even just the fact that like you said, it was encouraged that, your family saw that you were talented, your teachers saw this, and it was like, go do it, go see where this goes. So I guess I wanted to kind of link that to the upward aspiration part of the immigrant experience. Like, did you ever have a sense of like where you wanted to go with that art, or what you wanted to be? Like, were there role models or things you wanted to do with your art?
I'm smirking at you.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the aspirations and the talent were one step.
Yeah.
And the next step was, but you're a girl and you can just marry someone rich. Mm. Okay. And that was the story of my generation. Mm-hmm. As a woman, things were impossible. You had to be, the only professions that were open to you were teacher, nurse, and secretary, pretty much. 5% of all doctors were women at that point, compared with more than 50% now. You had to have money to go to medical school, plus medical schools had quotas for Jews and people of color. And so whatever aspirations you might have and whatever talent you might have, you were slapped right back down. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, I kind of ignored that and tried different things. I went to Brooklyn College, which was I had been recruited by private women's colleges, and I went to a T. They had a T to like try to recruit you to like, you know, Radcliffe and Wellesley and whatever the women's colleges. Mm-hmm. And it just scared me. The people scared me. I had no contact with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in my life. There were these like tall, waspy women wearing these little suits, serving these little tea and cookies, and I knew immediately that if I went to those places, I would be like a 2-for-1 prize for them. I would be a Jew and somebody poor that they would be helping out, and the idea of going there made me sick. Mm-hmm. And so I stayed at home, and also my family had a lot of problems, and I was kind of emotionally relied on, and I was, at that point, I wasn't ready to leave my family to its misery. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other story, and you can read about it in some of my comic strips. Mm-hmm. But, so I went to Brooklyn College. I worked at a summer camp the summer before. Now, the summer camp was run by the same people who ran the after-school program and the projects. And oddly enough, they were leftists, right? And the program, the after-school program counselors were from the Atlanta School of Social Work, which is a black college. Mm-hmm. And so the adults who were educated and made sense and were a calming and supportive group in my childhood were African American and Caribbean people, and particularly African American men who very soon after were heroes in the civil rights movement. And the city of New York came in and they shut down the after-school program for being communist, and I must have been about 8 years old at the time. And my parents were completely in support of this after-school program that was anti-segregation, that was pro-civil rights, that was anti-racist, and was socialist in terms of, yes, workers need to come together and fight for a better life. And this was a program that brought you up with those ideas, in addition to teaching little white Jewish kids African dance and playing Caribbean drums. Mm-hmm. So I had an odd childhood that way too. So I went to work at the summer camp, and I was younger than the other people by a year. They had already started college. And some of the other counselors said, well, there's this new group called SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and you're starting Brooklyn College, and we're going to hook you up with the people there. If you want to check them out, if you want to, if you want to get involved, we think you're going to like them. Mm-hmm. And so I did. So I started Brooklyn College, and what was going on then was the free speech movement. And we had our own little free speech movement at Brooklyn College because the college president was a McCarthyite tool named Harry Gideons. And they had instituted, well, Brooklyn College had its own, and the City College of New York had its own McCarthy hearings, and brought professors in front of this panel where they had to swear that they weren't communists. And they fired lots and lots of academics in the early 60s, late 50s, I guess it was. It was called the Rap Coudert panel or something. That's maybe a loose description of it.
Right.
So I started college after all the Reds had been cleaned out.
Wow.
And they had students weren't allowed to have to post flyers. Students couldn't invite speakers to campus. It was a little dictatorship. And so I was part of the people who kind of started college and said, okay, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And we had a faculty-student committee for free speech. And I was just a freshman. And I was a year younger. I skipped 8th grade. So I was like 17 when I started college, and I looked 12.
And that was
1964.
64?
Yeah.
Man, I mean, I guess just to kind of maybe link that to what we were talking about before, especially with your art, and like you said, like there was almost a sort of built-in aversion to capitalism in the kind of immigrant communities that you grew up in.
Right.
So, like, I imagine the folks at this summer camp thought you would want to plug in with the SDS folks because they sense some kind of political fire in you. I guess I wanted to kind of ask about that. Like, was there, was there ever kind of a moment where you got kind of more involved in politics, or was it just kind of, again, that sort of built-in sort of fight against like the injustice that was all around
What
you?
a good question. Yes. The quick answer is yes. I didn't realize that my views were, the way I grown up was different. And when I went to college, I woke up one day and realized that the U.S. wasn't a democracy. Because in addition to all the left-wing ideas, people had fled fascism and thought of the U.S. as a safe haven and loved being here because they were allowed, their family members remained alive. Evidently, there was a child born after my mother who was killed by the Cossacks. I found out about that later, murdered as a baby. And so the family was just very overprotective. And on the one hand, the views that my mother had were very left. And she was never a communist belonging to any organization, but she was very sympathetic. And she was in social groups that were definitely, she thought Eleanor Roosevelt was fantastic and that the benefits to workers needed to be fought for. But it hit me like a ton of bricks with the free speech fights. I mean, I knew about racism. I knew about civil rights. I was following what was going on there. But it was like, on a certain level, happening to someone else. And I didn't read the newspaper. And when I was at summer camp, people were reading the articles about the Vietnam War, which was a secret war at that time. And the draft was still in effect. And so first you had the civil rights movement, then I started college, and it wasn't a free atmosphere. It was completely, censored, especially for us. And then I was recruited into something called the Scholars Program, which was one of the first honors programs in the U.S. And that's because I had gotten the highest score in the proficiency chemistry test in the state of New York. I also was on the math team in high school. And I wasn't really that advanced in math. I didn't read about math. I didn't read about chemistry. I didn't have interest, but I just absorbed everything and had one of these kinds of ways of, which persists until today, of kind of guessing what was expected, guessing the answers, having an understanding of the gestalt of things, and being able to predict the trajectory of things, so that I can look at the situation in the world and I know which way things are going. And it comes in very handy doing political organizing, of being able to talk to people, understand what people are thinking, what the ideas are, what the media is telling people, and how to draw out the reality, the truth of what's going on underneath, behind the curtain. And so I was recruited to, a couple of us got together. We were all selected. We had similar backgrounds. And some of the people were really interested in math and physics and were real savants. And but the freshman group came together and said, what is this really about? We had our own lounge in the library building overlooking the rest of the campus. We had a lady who was always dressed perfectly, who made us coffee and tea and served us. We were like the privileged. And being the privileged really irritated us. And it's like, what are they trying? We're the guinea pigs for something.
Right.
And it turned out that we were the guinea pigs for to end up at Princeton's Applied Physics Lab to beat the Russians in science.
Wow.
And this is the height of the Cold War. Another point in which I really woke up, in a way, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And people in my high school, that was like 2 years before when I was like a junior in high school, I think. And people in my high school thought they were going to be dead that week, that the missiles were aimed at New York. And girls went and slept with their boyfriends because they didn't want to die as virgins. I did not do that. I didn't have a boyfriend or girlfriend. And I just lay on the floor of the living room at home watching the sky, waiting for the big flash. And I think that shook me up quite a bit. Yeah. And then people formed a student peace union, an anti-nukes group at the high school. And I was never really active in it, but I was considered part of it. So that was the period. So the free speech fight happened. Long story short, Harry Gideons, the right-wing McCarthyite, fled campus with his little tail between his legs. The student government invited him to a meeting, and he made the, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck speech, which was a famous anti-communist thing.
Right.
And and there was a guy sitting under his chair with a big microphone going like this. The whole student association was just laughing at him. And he and his flunkies just fled. And I did a comic strip about it called, of course I'm going to forget. But I'll give you the information about my blog spot later. And it was, can't remember the name of it, but it was about this whole period.
Yeah.
About the free speech fight. And then it went into the draft on campus. And people were being drafted for the war, and college students had an exemption. And then as the war progressed, by 1966, they decided to give a draft exam on a Saturday. And so they had an exam where for college students, and the people who scored high enough were free from the draft for a while. But if you didn't do well on the proficiency exam, you were draft bait, as we called it back then. Mm-hmm. And so we had a big demonstration of all the political groups on campus against the draft. And the demonstrations against the war really started to pick up nationally. SDS had national demonstrations in D.C., and it was a period the catchphrase was going from protest to resistance. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was in the scholars program. I was assigned to have a mentor in the art department, despite the fact that you weren't allowed to have a studio art major in the program. They didn't kick me out. And they assigned my mentor to be Ad Reinhardt, who is a very famous New York abstract expressionist who painted black-on-black paintings. Mm. The rest of the faculty at that point were pretty much also abstract expressionists, all men, except a few people. Printmaking was not abstract expressionist, and the painter Philip Pearlstein was a photorealist. Mm. So I'm in the art department. I'm being mentored to become an abstract expressionist. Reinhardt tells me, oh, you should just go up to 57th Street to the art openings and schmooze and hang out. And here I am, and I'm like 18 years old from the projects. Mm-hmm. I had no experience in that world. And the only thing I can imagine, the only way moving ahead would be to be like, I'd be the mistress of some old guy. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about going and hanging out on 57th Street with these, at the rich people's galleries?
Right.
I mean, what am I going to say to these rich people? I mean, how are they going to treat me? Mm-hmm. It was like when I went to the tea for the Seven Sisters colleges. Here I am, and I'm this little, I'm wearing hand-me-down plaid skirts from Catholic school kids. I mean, I had nothing. And what really changed my life was that there was a college trip to Europe. And I mean, we're going from the very beginning here. Yeah. So 1967, I convinced my family that I needed to go to Europe. And I had all the scholarship money. I had won academic scholarships, and I was going to a college that was free. And I was like putting the money in the bank and giving my parents a little money and saving it for my trousseau or whatever when I got married. Mm-hmm. And so I convinced my mom that it was okay. She could trust me. I could go to Europe. I was going to go with other college students. It was all fine. My grandmother was like, going to Europe? Look what we went through to get out of Europe.
Right. It's like running back into a burning building. Yeah.
Why would anybody want to go there? Mm. And then she says, well, the society people, they send their daughters to Europe to become finished. Maybe you'll stop wearing jeans and start wearing makeup, and you'll start acting like a girl. If you go to Europe, you'll become cultured, and, you won't be a troublemaker anymore, because here you are and you're headed for jail. Mm. The Cossacks are going to come after you in New York, and you're going to get blacklisted and you'll be in trouble. We have to do something. Mm. So she pulls up her dress, and she wore garters, like old-fashioned, like rubber bands around her legs to hold up her stockings. Mm-hmm. And she pulls a chunk of bills out of her stocking and says, here, go to Europe. So I went to Europe. First place the plane lands in London, and I pick up a copy of the International Times, which was the underground paper, and I go to a club and to hear a band called the Social Deviants. And they were pre-punk. I mean, they're known. And I spent one night at a youth hostel, and I ended up crashing at the dorm of the London School of Economics, which people had broken into.
Wow.
So I had to climb like over a fence and up a wall, and was crashing with a bunch of people, and it was, anyhow, had a bad run-in with some heroin addicts, and I picked up my bags and I left England. I was freaked out.
So you left the group?
I left. The people I was going to go with the group all split up when we got there.
Oh, gotcha.
My best friend went with someone else, and I was heartbroken. She went with somebody who was more marriageable material, like a sorority girl, because she had a boyfriend and I didn't. My best friend had a serious relationship, and I wasn't. I was too immature at that point. And so I went to Amsterdam. And I went to Amsterdam just as the Provo's anarchist youth movement was coming to a close. And within 2 days, I was with the people who had been the Provos. So the anarchist youth movement in Amsterdam. I was staying at the house of one of the theoretical leaders who was off camping in Lapland with his wife. And I was being looked after by anarchist gay guys.
Nice.
And so I learned about what's Take Back the Streets, because what the Provos did is they announced like poetry recitals at midnight at a main square in town, and it was all ignored the laws. It was all, it was strictly illegal. Amsterdam at that time, you have to remember, it was Catholic society, generally, really rigid, very uptight. And I met the people who were just completely making fun of it and taking it apart. And so I spent the summer together with people who were not only flamboyantly gay at the time and into art in the streets, and then traveled to Franco, Spain, with a woman whose brother was engaged to a working class woman in Barcelona. And so we stayed in the barrio in Barcelona in 1967 for several days, and then made it to Ibiza, which is was at the time the vacation spot for European gay men. It's still the islands. You take a ferry from Barcelona to get there. It was very safe for us gals. We could go anywhere, anytime at all, and nobody would bother us. And then I hitchhiked back to Amsterdam, and one of the guys from the crowd wanted to marry me so I could stay there and be part of the group and go to art school there for free. But I was the president of the SDS chapter. And the U.S. was 1967. It was right before 1968. I felt that I needed to come back because the life in Amsterdam was much too idyllic. I didn't see a direction forward. And I saw that art didn't have to be in galleries for the rich. I had already suspected this. I knew about artists like John Hartfield and George Gross, and people who did artwork that was part of mocking capitalism and their wars. And I saw that as my future.
Well, and, I'm also thinking about how you were saying that one of the things that made you sort of inherently good at math and science, right, was kind of being able to see where, like, the trajectory of things, kind of plot out where things were going. And you mentioned that translating that skill into kind of, seeing where the political winds were blowing, where kind of societal developments, what direction they were going in, what really helped you as an organizer. So I'm curious if, like, from Amsterdam in 1967, feeling this kind of draw to go back to the U.S. as 1968, which we know in retrospect, was a major year in American politics. I guess where was in your mind, where was the trajectory? Where were things going in the U.S. in 1967? Like, did you sense that something like 68 was on the horizon?
Well, 68 was, I mean, of course, I mean, I was already in SDS.
Mm-hmm.
I had seen where the free speech movement was going. And I knew the war was going to face more opposition from everywhere. In all the communities, the draft was devastating. And belief in the myth of what the U.S. was falling apart. Mm. And it had fallen apart for me, bit by bit. And I was pretty angry. Mm-hmm. I was pretty angry, and I wanted to be part of the action. And so in Amsterdam, the way I found people is that my friend Adinka, who I traveled to Spain with, was selling a newspaper on the street. And the newspaper was called the Witte Krant, the white paper, because the white was the color of the provost, because it was wear white when you're on your bike at night, which is a line from the Rolling Stones. They invented the free bike program. They had lots of the Provo free stuff.
Nice.
That preceded the Panthers' free breakfast program and all sorts of other things. They had free food stuff. They had free markets. And so I was already looking to doing artwork in an underground newspaper. So I came back to New York and went back home and realized I could never live at home again. Under the restrictions and the curfew and the having every part of my life pried into, and my father thought I was a drug addict, and I mean crazy stuff was going on at home. My father pretty much was flipped out and drinking, and I had to get out of there.
Yeah. And
so people from SDS did help me get out of there, because my parents wouldn't let me take my clothes or anything. And I went to my house with a bunch of guys and took my clothes. And my father, you can't have your bed. You can't have your furniture. And it's like, bye.
Man. I mean, still has to, I mean, yeah, it's hard to even kind of fathom, like, the complicated emotions in that sort of situation, right? Especially, as you said, with your family in large part kind of emotionally depending on you. But, like, yeah, you got things, political changes, sea changes kind of happening. Other people in a lot of ways depending on you for art, for leadership, for comradeship. Like, I guess when you left home, when you finally left, I guess when you said you wanted to be in the action, where was that action for you at that time?
Well, at that point, backing up, one thing I didn't mention, and then I'll get to that, is that my first arrest was in 1965. And I went to a party with my SDS friends, and my best friend in SDS was also from projects on the sewer houses on the Lower East Side. And we went to a party on the Upper West Side, someone with a big apartment and wealthy parents, and the parents were out of town. We had 88 people at the party, and I know that because 88 people were arrested. And it was a setup, and there were no drugs, there was no alcohol, we were all underage. And cops came in through the fire escape and through the front door and busted everybody for drugs and underage drinking, and there was nothing there. And we were defended in court by William Kunstler. like
Oh.
the most famous leftist lawyer
Yeah.
at the time. They dropped the charges. There was no evidence, and we had a lot of people had parents who had a lot of clout. My parents showed up at the courtroom. My father started beating me up in the courtroom, and people from Brooklyn College, radical groups, got my father off of me, and I went home with other people. And then I ended up going back home for a little while. So that's the kind of situation I was leaving. Mm-hmm. And it's like I didn't do anything wrong. I did nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. It's not true. Don't you trust me? No, they did not trust me. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, I came back from Amsterdam. And where the action was for me was I wanted to work on the left-wing underground press. Mm-hmm. And the name of that was The Rat. And it was a newspaper started in New York by former comrades in SDS, mostly people who were Texas anarchists in SDS. And this is a famous story that it's in many, many, many books on second wave feminism and other things too. And so I went to the Rat office and I said, I would like to do art. I want to do art with you. And they said, we already have artists. And I said, well, you know me. One of the people who had the same guy in summer camp who directed me to go to SDS. Mm. And they looked at me like I was like, why would we want you on this? And they wouldn't even look at my work, which wasn't that hot, I'll tell you at the time. But and so realized that the people who worked there, the only women, were girlfriends of the guys. And there's been like a lot written in the beginning of second wave feminism. Marge Piercy, the Grand Coulee Dam, other major documents about how women in the movement are not taken seriously. Mm-hmm. It's you have a conversation and the woman says something and the next guy goes back to whatever the comment was from the guy before, like the woman didn't exist. Right. There's a lot written about that. Yeah. And that was very true. And I was heartbroken because I figured, where am I going to have a chance? So I went to Rolling Stone. I was like, okay. Went to Rolling Stone. I said, I'd like to be on your art staff. And it was kind of like, go away, little girl. And then I went to The Guardian. And The Guardian was it's not The Guardian of today. Mm-hmm. It was the major leftist national newspaper against the war in Vietnam, and it wasn't connected to any political sect. It wasn't, or any political organization. It was originally, from 1948, the newspaper of the Progressive Party, mm-hmm. and the Henry Wallace campaign, which was a progressive left liberal, kind of like DSA. Mm-hmm. Is what I would compare it to today. And so I went to the end, and the people at the paper were courting the new left. And they had hired writers who were people I knew from SDS. There were a lot of faces I knew in the room. And what do you know? They hired me on the spot. Because they wanted their stodgy old left paper to appeal to the younger generation. And I was certainly the younger generation. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, you won't be doing any highfalutin covers or illustrations. You'll start at the bottom and you'll do layout and proofreading, and then we'll see how it goes. Well, 6 months later, I started doing illustrations, and 7 months later, I was doing the covers. And it wasn't because I had it all together. It was because I was the only person in the art department who could draw or had any art education or art sophistication. Mm. And so the art department would come together and we'd kind of kick around ideas and I would put it together. And some of it's hanging on the wall here. You can look at it later on. So I did the artwork, the cover of The Guardians, which instead of being densely filled with tiny type to fit in every precious word of ideological whatever, mm-hmm. they started, they had a new designer who had come right before I arrived, and they were doing like full-page photos or illustrations, much like the underground press, but much more serious. So I put my skills to use there. It was really exciting. I really developed, and at the same time, I was still going to college. And I was dating a jazz musician, and he'd be playing in clubs, and so I'd be up until like 3 a.m, and we'd get fed after the gig, and that's how we were eating. Because I was making so little money, I could hardly afford to live. Other people, like I had talked about before, the other writers and artists were usually married to somebody who had a job where they made money, or they came from a family that supported them with money. So I was living on a liverwurst sandwich and chips a day. And I was a chubby little 18-year-old, 19-year-old at the time.
So for me, my period for that was hot dogs and eggs. That was my go-to.
Oh God.
Well, and I mean, geez, it's so wild to kind of think about that now, right? I mean, because Lord knows that as far as we've made progress, but as far as the kind of gender dynamics that you're describing in left organizing spaces, not just in society writ large. And I think this will come up like as we start talking about things like Act 10, as we start talking about the labor movement. I don't know, there is kind of this weird sort of turning back, it feels like, or almost like it's not something that you progress from. It's something that's constantly pulling you back, and you have to constantly be fighting against it, if that makes sense. Like the battle for equality is never fully won, right? It's like constantly, you have to be constantly vigilant for it. And well, So I wanted to ask, kind of when your second career, because like you said, you've got two careers.
That's coming very soon.
Right.
This story.
So we've got, this young artist who's already kind of, been gone from the projects to, the Europe, to then back to designing the covers of The Guardian. So when did the second career kind of come in?
Well, at The Guardian, I was also part of an affinity group at demonstrations. And the Brooklyn College SDS chapter was evolving. A women's group came out of it. And we also developed a medics group in SDS, where we were ready I was already part of a group that was prepared to do first aid for tear gas at demonstrations in D.C. And one of the other people who was developing the medic pack and all of that ended up in nursing school with me too. And so out of the Guardian splintered. It was supposed to be a collective, a commune of people who decided on what would be in the paper, and it wasn't. It was a hierarchy. The staff, the writers, the artists had no say in what was going into the paper. They were supposed to have equal salaries. They didn't have equal salaries. And much to my dismay, I loved working with the people I was working with. I loved the art I was doing. And then the whole staff walked out over the inequalities and the hypocrisy. Hate hypocrisy. I always hate hypocrisy. And so it ended cataclysmically. And so soon after, there was the Miss America pageant demonstration in Atlantic City, declaring second wave feminism.
That was 71? God, maybe I'm mixing it up.
Before then, it was 69.
69.
69, yeah. Because I left The Guardian in 69, and later, or late 68. By 69, I was in a group which was Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which was a street theater group, the same street theater group that did the Miss America pageant. And we took over the bridal fair at Madison Square Garden. And there's a comic strip about that, too.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then soon after that, I get a phone call. Believe it or not, women are taking over the Rat, the underground paper that had treated me so poorly. Are you in? And of course, the women who are taking over the Rat knew my work from The Guardian. And I didn't know them personally, but they knew about me. And so I went to do the first women's issue of this underground paper. And it wasn't a women's liberation issue. It was an issue just like the Rat had been, about the draft and the war and black liberation and the Panthers and the Young Lords and the movement of the time. And it included women's liberation in the whole spectrum of activities. And the purpose of it was to prove that we as women were just as capable of being revolutionary writers, artists, capable of anything that the men could do, even though we had never been allowed to do it before. And so, again, long story short, we didn't give the paper back. And that is the famous moment. And so I continued in the Rat Collective and doing collective writing, collective editing, and doing covers for the Rat some of the time. And out of the Rat and the developing women's movement, we were asked, several of us, my best friend at the time, Barbara, and I, were asked to do research in women's health, because abortion was about to become legalized in New York. And what, as people in the women's movement, do we feel ought to be the factors counseling people in making their decisions? And so we learned a lot. We learned about women's bodies. We read the brand new Our Bodies Ourselves. We knew those people. And so I learned lots and lots about reproductive health and pregnancy. And as I was married at the time to a fellow activist, and we were living on the welfare deliveries of food and scraping by. And I had a job at the time, ironically enough at the time, typing the transcript of the Chicago conspiracy trial to make it into a book at the office of the New York Review of Books at night. So I was in this office typing the transcripts all by myself, night shift.
Wow.
And that was a really cool job. And they would treat people at the New York Review of Books, treated me with respect and kindness. And despite their high intellectual level of discourse, which I could not comprehend at the time, they were really good to me. And this was like, the realm of the publishers, the elite of the publishers of New York. They also had boxes of books they weren't reviewing, lining the hallways.
Yeah.
And I'd go home with a book bag full of books every time I went to work.
Oh, yeah. Whenever, even...
Oh, my God.
Even when I was a graduate student, like, if ever a professor would, like, put a box of books out when they were cleaning out their office, it was like flies on shit. Like, I would grab the box and run like I just stole something. Half of the books in my bookshelf are ones that I picked up like that. Oh, man.
Well, I remember getting John Reed's History of the Mexican Revolution.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are other books. They had some really good books. And so I took them, I gave them to friends. And so I'm like looking for a way to actually make a living. And so Barbara and I, having learned all this stuff, it's like, let me go check out nursing school. I have no idea what it would take, but it seems like nurses are pretty damn oppressed as a group, and it's a women's profession. It's going to be all women, pretty much. And I'd really like to maybe become a midwife, because midwives were first becoming a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was the period of the granny midwives coming to an end. In the South, it was only with the civil rights movement that African American women had professionally trained midwives attending their births, nurse midwives. In the days before African American women were allowed into hospitals. I mean, just the things I learned in that period. And my friend Barbara was, her mother is Haitian, and her dad is a Jewish refugee from Poland. So Barbara has the appearance of being an African American woman, although she grew up as the only brown-skinned person in a small town in Long Island.
Wow.
So, and we're in touch. A lot of these people from RAT, Barbara's husband at that period, we're all on Facebook together, which is really wild.
I bet.
So my RAT people from RAT also were co-founders of the Gay Liberation Front. And I was at the founding meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. There was like this constant new movements, developments every single day in this period. So the only nursing school I had ever heard of was downstate, which is State University of New York, because a cousin of mine had gone to medical school there, a male cousin, and out of the GI Bill. He had been in Korea. And so I go there and I walk into the office and they look at me and I look at them. And it's like, oh, yes, we have a nursing program. We just opened a nursing program. We only have 30 students and we don't have enough students. And we start Monday. Can you bring us your college transcript? So I go to Brooklyn College, I get my transcript, and I return. And it's like, oh, we'll give you a full scholarship. And just show up on Monday.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, my God. How did that happen? How did that happen? They weren't credentialed yet. So their program would make you not able to get into grad school. Although being the State University of New York, I didn't know what graduate school was.
Right.
I had no idea. I mean, I went to college. I had no idea. I knew there was medical school and law school. But graduate programs, I didn't know what that got you or how you got into it. I mean, my family was not college educated.
Yeah, I had
just
no clue what it was.
Clue.
Yeah, until basically someone told me, oh, you should go to grad school for that. And I was like, for what? For literature? Is that a thing?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew some art graduate students who, as you say, took me under their wing. I hadn't really given it very much thought. I had never thought about being a nurse. I was somebody, if I saw a worm on the sidewalk in front of me, I would freak. It's like, I almost stepped on that. And it's like people didn't really think I had the temperament suited for it, just in terms of the hierarchical structure. And also wounds and blood and icky stuff. But I soon found that when everything is that the whole human body is so fascinating, and learning to understand things, it was a whole wonderful layer of understanding that I gained. So the program that I was admitted to turned out to be specifically for people who had degrees in other fields. So not only was it a nursing school, it was what they call now a completion degree. And despite the fact that I never had a psychology course or a lot of the different requirements that normally would precede being in a medical field, because of my grades and being in the, graduating cum laude and all that kind of stuff. And they needed students. I just started right away. So in my nursing school class, was one of the women from Brooklyn College SDS, who I knew, and we hung out. We sat in the back row and we smoked through class.
Nice.
That was the old days.
Mm-hmm.
And so a year and a half later, without having much sleep in the interim, it was, going to college and majoring in art was nothing like going to nursing school. I mean, you really had to study.
Yeah.
Really, really had to memorize. So, I had gotten to the point of trying to get to be a New York teacher and teach art in high school. Mm. And I mentioned when we were off camera that I took the exam, and my exam was purposefully lost.
Right.
By somebody who knew my politics. And I figured that even if I did something about it, my life as a New York teacher at that point in history would have been miserable. Mm-hmm. And nursing was something I could just carry with me. And whatever I did in life, I could always have useful work. Plus, it's being a women's profession and highly underpaid. And so I went to nursing school, and in nursing school, I ran into people who were the doctors who refused to serve in Vietnam and refused to train medics in the Army. And Howard Levy and the beginnings of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Mm-hmm. And the people who had been the medics in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, who were a group called the Medical Committee for Human Rights. Previously, it had been an all-doctors kind of group. And things were moving in the direction of being all health professionals. Mm. And I met Ann Hirschman, mm-hmm. who was a veteran. And she was one of the first street medics. And she was the person who got me into Medical Committee for Human Rights and also into the trajectory of being a street medic all my life.
And what was it? I mean, can I ask, because today, I guess the term street medic is thrown around a lot,
right.
Especially in kind of activist circles. And granted, we've been living in a particularly kind of pointed period of protest in the U.S. and beyond. And so, we had the kind of anti-police state, anti-police brutality protests last summer after the police murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, ad infinitum. And so there was a lot of talk about, street medics, how to kind of find them and if you're tear gassed and so on and so forth. But it's, I'm curious to know what it was like, at that moment when the concept of a street medic was really kind of emerging and what it was like for you to kind of be one of the first people in that.
Well, Anne invented the idea of street medic.
Well, there you go.
And she was recently interviewed as Grandma Street Medic in the New York Times. They discovered her.
Nice.
She's wonderful. She was actually a medic during the civil rights demonstrations. And the idea of it was that you didn't necessarily have to be a health professional, that you would just be trained to deal with situations that came up. And when it was a situation where people were being injured by the police, that you knew what to do, and not just the first aid idea, but how to deal with situations that happen in the context of a demonstration, and how to triage, which is a term that came from the military, would assess people to know the nature and the seriousness of the injury. And opposed to the triage of the military, which triages and evaluates how soon you can send somebody back into combat, our triage was more how many people can we just take care of and get away from the demonstration? How many people do we need to get to the nearest ER? And how many people can we take to an ER outside of the conflict zone so that there aren't police in the ER waiting to arrest them? And that's the short and sweet beginning of it all.
Well, so the thing that I think is really kind of amazing, impressive, beautiful, I don't even know the right adjective for it, right, is, we talk a lot about the radical 60s generation and how a number of people, quote unquote, grew up, right, or sold out, as I guess is the more polite word.
Yeah.
But like, there's always this kind of talk of like how people transferred their politics into other stages of their life, other careers and whatnot. And what I find so incredible about your story is that whether we're talking about art or whether we're talking about nursing, it's like you always channeled those back into the movement somehow. Like it seems like throughout your life, all the way up till now, it was always like, how can I use this for politics in some way? Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's it, but it's politics, non-electoral politics, for sure. And it's the possibility of people developing critical thinking and learning and agency. Because that's the kind of world I want to live in. And I want to be among people who think that way. And over time, I see things changing. I mean, that's part of the changes are phenomenal in a good way. At the same time as capitalism becomes more concentrated and oppressive, people's ability to change every institution is, it's 70 something years. Of course it would change. If I look back, what always kept me on track too is I think back of what if I was born 100 years ago? What would my life be like? And with arranged marriages, I would have an arranged marriage in just abject poverty with soldiers threatening to kill me. And it was very much like other groups facing genocide. That's one of the reasons why I've been working with Native American people who are facing genocide in the same historical period, and other people too. I mean, every time there's, and then that I live in the U.S., that's behind so many of these genocides and horrible oppression on every level, when it was supposed to be something different altogether, theoretically, but it never really was that. I mean, that's like, I accept that that's what the reality is. I don't have illusions. As years go by, I have less and less illusions about how the world works. And I think the power that I have as an individual comes from joining with other people who see that, and our ability is to put the issues on the table in the first place. We don't have the power to right the wrongs or change things, but we have the power to inform the public, to put things in visual terms that can't be forgotten, and make the movements that there are, make them memorable, and make people feel part of them, to invite people in rather than to build walls for people becoming involved. And the thing is that the things that I'm involved with, I always know that I'm right.
Right.
I'm right. This would be a helpful thing. This would make the world a better place. And people should know that. People should know that healthcare is a right. People should know that healthcare should be available to everybody, and it should be based on science and based on people's need, and not based on the profit making of corporations, that the healthcare system itself is upside down. And every other institution that you can look at, the people who are in power are the wrong people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and then some. I mean, even the structures that keep them in power are themselves kind of like the instigators of that wrong that you were talking about, that pain that is inflicted on so many people. And I was really captivated by how you described, right, like the role of art in building consciousness, building political consciousness, sticking in people's memory, reminding people that it's not only necessary for us to remember these things, right, but to feel them for the wrongs that they are and act on them. And that, I think, brings us kind of fast forward to like the struggles that in a lot of ways we're here in Wisconsin to cover. But I guess before I get to that, I wanted to circle back to the nursing part of it, because you were saying, even in the description you were just giving, right, I know from what we were talking about on and off camera before, is that to really, I guess, bring it to eye level for people who are watching, you said that as a street medic, you were also, like, for instance, there providing that service for Indigenous folks who were doing like the longest walk. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So guys, could you talk about that?
Yeah, I didn't actually have to do any actual care. I just had to be there with my little Maryland license because there were thousands of people in Greenbelt camping out. And a guy kind of showed up at my door from the Sioux Nation and said, "We've been given your name as somebody who would help us. We're going to be camping out tomorrow in Greenbelt, and Native Americans from every part of the U.S. are demanding that the treaty rights be upheld. And we just need you to be at the camp because we need 2 people with RN licenses at the camp to make it legal for us to be there." And my response is I have a 2-year-old and I don't know if I can find childcare that quickly. And he just looks at me and said, "Oh, we have our kids along. Just bring them." Mm-hmm. So I found another friend, and I had no camping equipment and no experience camping. And somebody, another comrade who is a veterinarian whose job was substituting for other veterinarians on vacation, a radical veterinarian, itinerant. And so we went down to Greenbelt and camped out. And it was just marvelous. I mean, we were just like hanging out watching the bonfires and people in regalia. And that's kind of how I reacted. People would ask me to do things, and if I thought it was like a good thing to do, I would just do it. Mm-hmm. And all through life, it's been a thing. It's, I'll do something, and it leads to somewhere else. When it's like you do something creative and interesting, somebody sees it, and then they invite you to do something else. And so I've done artwork in every possible kind of medium with different groups. I mean, I did like somebody wanted me to do like black and white slides before we had video, when it was actually a material piece of film, to be projected for a silent theater performance. So the narrative was carried by the black and white slides, and then there was a live musical score. And this was with somebody who is a friend and ex-roommate when we lived communally, who's a fantastic musician and poet. And so, so you hear the program, invite me to do something cool. Mm-hmm. And I'll say, I haven't done that before. And the same thing happens. I make giant puppets too. And we'll be making some more for water protection events. The ones I have now, some of them are already out in the world on their own. at places of conflict against mines and against pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not like personal property to me. They're like I make them and then they go out into the world, and that's what gives me joy. And the fact that I don't have to rely on making a living doing it gives me a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard. People who are trying to make a living being political artists. I mean, it's very, very difficult. And it was impossible in my generation.
Right.
I mean, politics and art were very separate, and they were separated during the McCarthy period. And having content in art and having narrative and having a story was looked down on and excluded from galleries and museums, pretty much, in the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s.
Yeah.
In the U.S., not in other places.
Well, and, the career that, you made that in many ways allowed you to continue producing that art, right, was becoming a school nurse, right, here in Wisconsin.
Well, yeah, it ended up there.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess walk us through that path then.
Okay. So I went to nursing school. I got a job in labor and delivery at the hospital where I had gone to school, which is Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn. And it was a high-risk labor and delivery, which meant that people had major health problems or other conditions like drug addiction or high blood pressure or chronic diseases, and were going into labor. And right out of school, I was the only person on night shift all by myself because the good old Governor Rockefeller had a job freeze going on. So I stayed there for 6 months out of loyalty, and then I just said, this is not safe. I can't do this anymore. I mean, not only was I not the only nurse, there was no clerk, there was nobody.
Jeez.
There was nobody at all. I was there all by myself in July with brand new residents who were coming in from places around the world who would write doctor's orders that were complete nonsense. And I had to go up the chain of command and get them in trouble for writing wrong drugs, wrong dosages. And here I am right out of school.
Yeah.
So it got to be real dicey. I wanted to be a midwife at that point, and there were no jobs in health departments in New York because of the cuts. Now now we're at the end of the cycle where we see having no health departments that are functional except for a very narrow scope of activity have brought us with COVID. But when I started as a nurse, there were health departments, and the services that they gave were really wide. There were prenatal clinics, there were well baby clinics, there were VD and TB clinics. There were nurses who would go out to the home and teach new mothers baby care. Nurses were assigned to a district or a census tract in a city, and you knew those streets and you knew the people. You wore a uniform, you walked in those streets, people would call you into the house and you went in. Talk about a different period of history.
Yeah.
And so I moved to Baltimore, got a job with the Baltimore City Health Department, and lived in a communist collective.
Nice.
And so organized an MCHR group there for radical health professionals with along the lines of healthcare is a right, not a privilege. That's where that came from.
Was it like just total voice in the wilderness at that point?
No.
Or was
it was incredibly, the voices at that point were not in the wilderness. We had just past the point of the height of the movements of the 60s. People who were anti-war, who were feminists, who were Panthers and Lords, were moving into their adult lives. And so medical students were going to medical school because they actually wanted to make a difference. And we did things like a counter orientation program for the new students, telling them that they had to be aware that ridiculous hours and the browbeating and the punishments and the intimidation they would go through as medical students were determined to turn them into the kind of people who would think, I need, if I make hundreds of thousands of dollars, I went through hell to get here and I deserve every penny and it's all about me. And so we went to counter orientation programs, and it's like, you're going into this to serve the people. You're coming out of an era where we realize that the system doesn't work and medical school doesn't work either. And the medical system doesn't work. For-profit system doesn't work because the research goes into things that are going to make profits, not what the needs of the people are. So we went to medical students, and it had tremendous appeal. And lots of people got involved. And so within a few months, we had a group of 40 people, mostly medical students, people who were interested in occupational health, and not just doctors, nurses, radiology techs, pharmacy techs, like everybody involved. We also had drug counselors and social workers who were ex-nuns, who were involved with the Berrigans previously and with the anti-war movement. So it was a fabulous group, and we did lots of interesting things. And I worked at the health department and had friends who came to work there to organize as well. Other people who eventually did become midwives came and worked there. Plus, there were other people who were countercultural, and there were people involved in Black liberation movements who worked at the health department. And so, strangely enough, I quickly was elected to be the person who bargained the contract for the nurses in the Baltimore Health Department and the city hospital at age 26.
Wow.
And so nobody else wanted to do it. Nobody had a clue about how to do it. And I didn't have a clue, really.
You drew the short straw?
Yeah. I really wanted to do it. I really wanted to do it. And I had lots of ideas. I had ideas about how to shake things up in a good way. So I negotiated with the city fathers, who looked and acted exactly how you would imagine they would look at that point in history, like Tammany Hall, Stooges. And we came up with, as a group, we came up with a list of professional concerns for negotiating the contract. Now, we didn't belong to an actual union. Our union was through the Nurses Association. And I also got nominated and organized the educational part of the State Nurses Association convention around the principle healthcare is a right, and invited various radical healthcare organizers and thinkers to speak to the nurses, and people who were like blue-haired Christian ladies, is all I could say, who worked in the TB clinic. Really liked the idea of healthcare in China after that. I mean, it was just like healthcare, and you have people going into the community and finding out what people need, and then anyhow. It was very interesting and effective organizing. And so the professional concerns are, oddly enough, were that only the nurses knew how many staff we needed to do the job right. And we're at the point in history now, 50 years later, where staffing is like coming into the point of being law. Adequate staffing, led by the California Nurses Association, National Nurses United, which is a fabulous group. And unfortunately, we don't have them here in Milwaukee. They're in Illinois and they're in Minnesota. And sadly, most of the nurses in Milwaukee are not unionized. And that was another reason that made working for the school system very appealing, is that I would be in a union again. All the years that I worked as a nurse in labor and delivery at Johns Hopkins Hospital and at Sinai Hospital in Milwaukee were non-union. And when I retired from Sinai, they cut my pension by a third because they wanted to build more hospitals. And they could because they or not union.
Not union.
There's nobody to fight it. Right. So I went from the health department in Baltimore, and strangely enough, the mayor, William Donald Schaefer, at the time, the sanitation workers went on strike in Baltimore when I was the union representative for the nurses. And so the sanitation workers were picketing City Hall, and they planned an action where they were going to dump garbage on City Hall. So Mayor Schaefer commanded that the public health nurses clean up the garbage.
Shit.
Okay, we get into Baltimore and The Wire here. Shit. I love The Wire. My favorite piece of nonfiction.
Classic.
Oh, God. So, yes, the district that I was in is the same Western district that those streets are the streets that I walked in the 1970s. So I love The Wire, and I knew some of the real people who were in it.
Yeah.
At the soup kitchen.
Wow.
Brendan and Willa and the Catholic worker people. But so the nurses, a bunch of us, of course we weren't going to pick up the garbage. But we were rather offended.
Imagine.
Yeah. So a bunch of us actually went and helped the sanitation workers dump the garbage on City Hall. And then I spoke at the press conference in my little public health uniform that looked like a World War II Navy wave uniform, like blue uniform with a little collar and a little hat. I love those uniforms. And I raided the back closet of the old uniforms. So I was wearing some of these like retro 40s little outfits.
Nice.
Okay, it was very nice. And so, yes. And so, as a radical nurse, we were supportive of the city workers. We were part of the city workers. But unfortunately, Ronald Reagan came into office, and he decided that health departments had to be privatized. And so, subsequently, everything like prenatal services, baby care, were all funneled into health maintenance organizations. It was the age of the HMOs. And the HMOs made big promises of taking care. They'd get funding and they'd take care of everybody's every need. And they ended up being, it was a scam like every other. I mean, I'm sure there's some good HMOs.
Right.
So my job at the health department was eliminated. There was no more prenatal visiting, home visiting coming from the health department. Our prenatal clinic was taken over by the hospitals. And I moved on. I went to Johns Hopkins, which was the big hospital in the city, and was hired to work on a medical research floor at first because they didn't have jobs in labor and delivery. And the management of nursing followed me around all day long for the first few weeks I was there. They didn't know what I would do. Instant revolution of nursing. But
I was going to say, so they saw your press conference?
Well, they knew all about me.
They knew all about
me. But they also knew that I was, they couldn't see not hired. They must have hired me first and then realized who they hired.
Yeah.
But, so I worked at Hopkins for 11 years. And I ended up being the charge nurse in labor and delivery at one of the most high-risk OB units in the world, and met the choppers flying across the Chesapeake Bay on the heliport, and won the respect of coworkers who knew my politics. And we had other people in MCHR at the hospital, residents and interns and MDs, and we were able to be ourselves at work. The population was by and large African American people from the surrounding community, and we gave very, very good care. We gave the best care there of any place I've ever worked. And I could go into details, but we were prepared for emergencies. And then I was there until I ended up moving to the Midwest because my husband got laid off from Bethlehem Steel permanently when they automated, and he went back to school and walked away with all the writing, fiction, and poetry prizes from University of Maryland and got recruited by University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So we moved here in 86. And in 86, I got a job in labor and delivery at a midwifery-centered hospital that no longer exists. When I had my own children and knew what it was like to be woken up every 2 hours at night, I decided that being a nurse midwife when you were on call every other night was not a good mix. But my former roommate in the collective, Charlene, did become a nurse midwife and later became a major anti-racist academic.
Wow.
People from my circle did not become capitalists. People all are, either they're academics in a good way or they're in the helping professions one way or another. They're healthcare or teaching, and some people are still doing factory work.
Do you think there's, not to, pop psychologize too much, but do you, as someone who has lived that and who has done that yourself, not gone that sort of capitalist route, right? Not gone the way of so many once radicals who then convince themselves that there's nothing more radical than the free market, right? Or what have you, or like the real revolution was bringing kind of the spirit of the 60s into the worlds of business and finance, cool capitalism, or what have you, right?
Well, you know what happened at Woodstock. I was a medic at Woodstock.
You were a medic at Woodstock?
Yeah,
okay.
Briefly.
Okay.
But I was supposed to be there. I went there with people from the underground press, and people brought a press there, and we had a press tent, but we never were able to put out a paper there. The rain and the situation was too crazy. But and I was a medic at different anti-war political campaigns. And that helped me. That was before I went to nursing school.
Okay.
And that kind of pointed me in that direction, too. I met radical doctors.
Yeah.
And people in MCHR kind of leading up to that. But, yeah.
Really, the question just is like, is it just luck of the draw? Like, is it just that you were fortunate enough to meet, people who were also committed to kind of those helping professions, to not kind of sacrificing their political principles for personal profit? Or is there something that you found, like, that you can see, like, okay, people who were of this type went this way, people who were of that type went that way?
Well, you probably know the quote better than I do. Is the Che Guevara quote about, true revolutionaries are motivated by love?
Yeah.
Is that people who could work well together, who respected each other, who were inspired, who had creative ideas, who were doing things, who were coming up with new ways to do things all the time, of being a step ahead of what was expected of us, like the women taking over the bridal fair, like the Miss America pageant, like the Rhodesian Chrome boycott. In Baltimore, also when I was a public health nurse in those years, I may have been working at Hopkins in that same period, there was a boycott. South Africa, people were building shanty towns and camping out on campuses all over the place against apartheid. And that may have been a little after, a little before. But there were ships bringing an important component of iron, of making iron into steel, Rhodesian chrome. And ships were coming from apartheid Rhodesia, draconian fascist Rhodesia, to the U.S. And people all over the U.S. organized in support of the Rhodesian people. And the way we did that is that we'd go to the docks when a ship was coming in. Friends would, like, in Baltimore, they post the comings and goings of the ships. Well, people would find out when the Rhodesian ships were coming in. We'd go down to the docks at 5 a.m. and leaflet the workers and talk to the workers who were driving in. Now, the majority of the dock workers were African American. And it was the Revolutionary Black Workers, League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and it was people who would later, some people who had been Panthers, who were later Panthers. There were people from the shipyards, there were people from Bethlehem Steel, and there were also some health professionals. We'd all go down to the docks, and people refused to unload the chrome. The ships, and we weren't the first place the ships came. The ships would go to New England. People would not touch the Rhodesian chrome. They'd go down to New York. They'd go to New Jersey. They'd go all down the Atlantic coast. They'd go to Norfolk afterwards, and I knew the Norfolk folks who were doing it. And they'd have to go all the way through the Panama Canal and try the West Coast. And the West Coast.
Then they ran into Oakland.
And they were in the West Coast. And the longshoremen on the West Coast were much redder than ones on the East Coast. Oh, my God. And they would go all up the West Coast, and nobody would touch the ore, and they'd have to take it right back to Rhodesia. And it was tremendous. The feeling of international worker solidarity, that stays with me. The fact that things like that can happen, not just in a city where the nurses go out with the sanitation workers, not just the college students working together with people refusing to go to Vietnam. I mean, the alliances that people form, they make a difference. They make a real difference. And I never forget that. I never forget that. And it's also, people didn't do it the normal way. I mean, it wasn't like we were inventing new forms of organizing, new forms of putting the issues out to people, not relying on the government, relying on our own ingenuity and people we knew. And, those victories are a long time ago, but I can look back now. I can look back now at the way that nurses were treated. When a doctor came into the nurses' station, you had to stand up and give him your seat. I had to wear this stupid hat. We won't go into it. And I'd bonk it on the railings around the patient's beds, and the bobby pins would pull my hair. But the way, with all that needs to be done yet for women being treated with respect in this country, with missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country, with we've still got a long way to go, but we've made a big difference. We made a big difference in the way that women give birth. And that was my goal, not just organizing nurses in a union, but changing the culture of the way that nurses and patients interacted, giving people choices, giving patients autonomy, teaching women about the process of childbirth, restoring that knowledge that women used to have that was taken away, other than women who grew up on farms and saw animals giving birth. We didn't know what labor was. It was not polite to talk about it in the 1950s and the early 1960s. Women didn't breastfeed. Breastfeeding was taken away because mechanical things were much superior to our poor women's bodies back then. And in the U.S., in the modern U.S. So it's been a long process. Midwifery, which was considered a lowly kind of way to give birth, that was only for the very poor, has come back, and doctors haven't taken over childbirth and making it into a male-controlled process. Now women are 50% of all doctors, and we have midwives, and we have freestanding midwifery centers, and we have childbirth education. But I could go into those details more. For a long time, I still kept hold of the straps that women were strapped onto a birthing table, lying on their backs with their legs up in the air, strapped like somebody who is going to be executed. Their hands were in straps. Their legs were in straps. They were given anesthesia that would make them not be aware of what was happening. And that's not birth anymore in the U.S. And I worked with wonderful people who helped that happen. And I've always worked in teaching hospitals, and I've always worked in central city places with women who deserved the kindness and the teaching more than anybody. And I had my taste of the upper class at Johns Hopkins, where people treated me like I was their maid instead of a nurse, instead of a medical professional. Yeah. I had a bit of that and said, ain't for me.
Yeah, I can imagine that's not an environment that you would gel with. I mean, but amazingly, you because it's like something that was always there, right? Always present, right? Even back when you were kind of a young artist in New York, right? It's just like, do you want to go in the schmooze in those galleries? It's like, no, that's not my scene, man.
You want to marry a doctor? And like, no.
Nah, I'm good.
I'm going to marry somebody just like me. Mm-hmm. When I did.
And you did. And you said, right, that, so it was when your husband got laid off from Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, which, the real news being in Baltimore, like there is definitely a deep kind of history there that I want us to explore for viewers and stuff like that. But y'all came over here to Milwaukee, and so you became you got a nursing job there.
Right.
So when did you end up working in the school system?
Okay, quick trip. 17 years working in OB in the hospitals. And then my husband went back to school and got a library degree because he never finished English grad school. He just taught because he was a good teacher and they would just rehire him. And he got a job up in Ashland County on Lake Superior as a librarian at Northland College, which was one of the first schools to specialize in environmental science. I briefly got a job there in the float pool at the hospital there, and was the only person with a college degree in nursing. Everybody else had a degree from the local community college. And real briefly, I was shunned because I'm not Christian. Mm-hmm. And people would come up to me, "What do you do on Christmas?"
Right. All those ways that they get around the illegality of the question.
And then it's like, "Well, I work so you can be off."
Nice.
Was the answer. And then I saw blatant racism against Native Americans, ridiculous, crazy stuff. Like anyone who was Native American would get a social work referral to get like their home examined to see if they were capable of taking care of their baby.
Wow.
And so Ashland Hospital is the hospital where Ojibwe women from Bad River and Red Cliff reservations, that would be the closest hospital. Mm-hmm. And then also LCO, Le Coudray, is close. Duluth is like an hour and 15 minutes drive west. And Duluth has real hospitals. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I had never worked in a rural hospital where the surgery team had to come in from home, where the anesthesiologist had to come in from home when there was an emergency. At Hopkins, we had a C-section table or two set up and covered. And so somebody could arrive and have like a life-threatening situation happening where the baby is in trouble. We'd find it out. We'd take the person, wheel them back on the exam table or the bed directly from the admission room in the OR, and we could have the baby out in 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. It was like the amazing crack team of reality. Mm-hmm. People were there, the doctors, the anesthesiologists were all in the unit. They were some of the best people in the world. They were faculty. They were pro-choice. They were really brilliant, a lot of really brilliant people, and really up on the latest knowledge. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, I went from that to a small hospital where the guys had to come in from home, where everything I did was questioned because people had never seen it before. It's like nurses at Sinai. You can insert internal monitoring, like the electrode that goes on the baby's scalp to see if the heart rate, to monitor the heart rate. And I was accused of lying by saying I knew how to do it and did it all the time. So I learned the term gaslighting. Mm-hmm. And it was just horrible. So I left under harassment. And strangely enough, I gave a speech at the college. At the time, it was anti-war stuff about the war in, Iraq and Afghanistan and all that. And I talked about military triage, and it was the time where things were getting exposed about Walter Reed Hospital and the conditions of medical care for veterans coming back. And somebody heard me talk. And all of a sudden, the county health department posts a job, half-time and no benefits, but a job as community organizer around health issues, and called social marketing. I didn't know what social marketing was. Mm-hmm. So I went and applied for the job, and they evidently had heard about my speech, and they knew about me in the hospital because it's a small town. Yeah. And I was not quiet about the racism against Native Americans at the hospital. The incident came where I was told I had to write up a social work referral on a Native American woman who had given birth, who was a pharmacist. And it's like, and what's the reason for writing up somebody who has higher education than we do? Mm-hmm. For a social work referral? And she's Native American. I said, no. This is like illegal. It's racism. It's illegal. I can't do this. If you want to do it, you do it, but I'm not going to be quiet about it. And that's when I had already said some things. Mm. One of my either graces or faults is that I can't help but let the things that make me angry come out. Yeah. And I'm direct. And I've been accused of being abrasive at times, but the things need to get said. Mm-hmm. They need to get said, and they need to get said strongly and in a polarizing way sometimes. I mean, real. It's real. Yeah. You're the real news. I have to be real. Okay. So in Ashland, I got to work with the Bad River tribe. In Milwaukee, I had already been involved with the native, non-native anti-mining movements since I had gone to grad school and was writing for the newspaper. I was the editorial editor of the paper and wrote about the spearfishing wars of the 80s, and that's a whole other topic. About the violence, the Klan and racist violence against Native Americans asserting their legal rights off the reservation and the treaty territories. Anyhow, so I learned a lot about that before I moved to Ashland. I had a anti-mining bumper sticker on my car. And so I'm in Ashland, I'm working at the health department, creating a role that nobody knew what it was. And so I did wrote an arts grant, collaborated with puppet makers, did programs about how your body works in the school system, did exhibits about, and I wrote the health column for the local paper. And so it was very empowering. It was people who came from completely different background than I did, who I worked with, in a 5-person health department. And they were all beyond competent. I mean, they were just, compared to people at the hospital, really, really smart, competent, creative, and outspoken. 5 women. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the current state of public health in Wisconsin. Then a Democratic governor got elected, and realized that his appointments of advisors to all his committees didn't go farther north than Wausau, Wisconsin, which is in the middle of the state. And so there were no appointments. Governor Doyle didn't appoint anybody north of Wausau. So I get this phone call from his campaign manager person, who turned out to be the editorial editor at the same college paper 2 years after I was. Okay. And he's like one of the heads of the Democratic Party in the state. And he says, I know this is kind of a surprise, but the governor didn't appoint anybody. We'd like to appoint you to be an advisor on children's health. And it's just like a committee. It has no power, but you can advise. You can come up with, you meet with other people who are like really the top health people in physical activity and nutrition. And so I did for 8 years. And it was like 4 meetings a year. I went down to Madison on the clock at work. And I learned lots and lots about what was wrong with the school diet, why you need to have more physical activity, and how the different variety of ways that people organize in the schools to bring these about with no money.
All right.
So P.S., my husband's job turned out to have lots of problems. We moved back to Milwaukee, and I'm looking for a job. Here I am, an advisor to the governor. I applied at the health department. They interviewed me, and I said, they were advertising on TV at night that they needed public health nurses. So I said, I'm going to get a job there, right? It won't be any problem. I already know all the state programs. I know how to use their computer system. I know all the immunization stuff. This is a shoo-in. I go and I have my interview. Didn't hear back for over a year because they really weren't hiring anybody. It was all, the Milwaukee Health Department is way troubled for a long time. And so, meantime, I go to work for less than a year, doing home health care, and get injured on the job, wrecked up my shoulder, and while I'm post-op, drugged up on morphine, I get a postcard in the mail from MPS, and that's how I became a school nurse. They have this postcard, we're hiring. I responded immediately, got an interview, and here I am with my arm in a sling and operated on, and 2 hours after the interview, I get a call back. You are serious about coming, aren't you? We have a job for you, and we're going to hold it until you're ready. And then, we'll make sure whenever you want to come to work, we've got the job for you. I wanted to be in a high school. Nobody wanted to be in a high school. And they had the people who were the heads of the nursing department. There were no nurses in the high school before then. This was around 16 years ago now. Okay. And I ended up working until I retired. I worked for MPS for 10 years. So I got hired, and there were no predecessors. So like in Ashland, I got to create what a high school nurse does. And then won the respect of the management with ease. And then they had me mentor all the other high school nurses coming in. And I've never worked with management who is that wonderful. They were people who fought for nurses in the schools. they got grants as a pilot program to get nurses in the schools. And I mean, the thing that drove it was all the diabetic kids in the schools and the crises that came up and needing an RN to supervise their insulin, sliding scale insulin, according to what they ate.
Wow.
And there were so many crises that that was one of the things. And then improving attendance. And we achieved that and much more, much, much more. And I have to say that the supervisors who fought for nurses in the schools and somebody who was a grant writer who ended up leaving and going to a PhD program are among the smartest nurses I've ever worked with. And what's more, they let me be myself. Mm-hmm. they had the judgment to know what I could do in using my skills organizing in the school to make the school function better. And it wasn't easy to put into practice because principals tend to be totalitarian dictators. Mm-hmm. And they had never worked with a nurse before. And it took a little while for them to realize what I was doing. But what was required is we come into the school, and previously nurses had been given free as a donation from the different hospital systems. And they'd come in maybe, 2 hours twice a week and do either Planned Parenthood type stuff and work on contraception, or they would work on, doing education to prevent VD. But there was nobody who was actually part of MPS and part of the system. Mm-hmm. For the kids who were diabetic and other children who needed IEPs, individual education plans, who had different disabilities, and there was a medical component, there was a traveling team who would go school to school and research each child's needs. But they didn't have the ability to see that child on a daily basis, on their good days, on their bad days, know the child, mm-hmm. know the teenager, have a relationship with them. Mm-hmm. Because of that, I think it was, a profound right way to do things. I knew 800 kids by name.
Yeah.
I knew I had in my computer system, I had the history of times they had come to see me. I had their medical records when I requested them. I had spoken to their parents. I knew what was going on at home. I knew how they were doing in school. I knew their teachers. I knew their friends. It was as close, other than having a limited ability to actually deliver health care beyond teaching and first aid and dealing with managing different situations. It would have been better to have a clinic in the school where you could actually treat things. Right. And there are people on the school board that really wanted that to happen. But that was not yet to come. Mm-hmm. So I found, it was very stressful.
Yeah.
I'd come home and my husband did not want to hear about it. At dinner time, especially.
Mm-hmm. You didn't want to hear about all the ailments of a bunch of teenagers.
He didn't want to hear about the conflicts with the administration, about going face to face with the police, mm-hmm. about telling the police that I was going to examine a kid before they had a chance to talk to them if there had been a fight, mm-hmm. that I knew that the child had a health condition and I wasn't going to tell them what it was. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And they'd say, she doesn't have asthma, she's just all hyped up from being in a fight. And I said, wouldn't you be in a pickle if it was asthma?
Yeah. Yes,
I'm protecting you. And they say, oh,
Right.
Yeah, you got it.
Well, and
how can you do this, you little woman?
Right.
Okay.
I mean, and it's something that, I mean, I know I've heard from, a number of healthcare professionals, and over the years, right, is, I was just talking to Zeni Triunfo Cortez, who's, I think, one of the co-presidents of National Nurses United. And
I've been on calls with them.
calls with her. So,
I go on their calls, and I also have been on with them with a direct Facebook page of the frontline nurses around COVID as a kind of old experienced person who wants to be supportive,
Right.
and had note writing exchanges with people who are like, this isn't right, what do you think? And I kind of encourage people to stand up.
Yeah.
And for protective equipment. And I've been doing that kind of thing just because I want to know what's happening and I want to help them.
Well,
But
thank God
great.
you are.
They're great.
Yeah, I mean they are, and but it's like, the sad thing is that I hear just different versions of what you were just describing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, whether it's healthcare or a million other things, just the kind of, reducing this service, reducing this care to a model where you just treat, the tasks at hand and the
Yes.
people involved as just like numbers on a screen, or parts to be assembled or disassembled. Like, you can't give the type of care for the whole human being that you need to if you're not given the time, the resources, and the ability to build those relationships, to build that sort of fleshed out knowledge about the patient and thinking about them as a whole human being, not just someone with a red,
Yeah.
glowing part of their body that says, fix that, right? I mean, it's just treating everything in this goddamn society like, I don't know, yeah, it's part of like an assembly line that just needs to be done in the quickest possible way,
Right.
with the least amount of cost, so on and so forth.
So,
And I mean,
I did, again, it's like when I worked as a public health nurse in Baltimore, and they did it the right way.
right,
And they had a nurse for every census tract, and you walk the streets, and the guys from the corner would call you over, and they knew who you were. She says, I hear that so-and-so in that house, she's pregnant and she hasn't been to the doctor yet. And so you go knock on the door, and it's like, so-and-so on the corner sent me over. I mean, can you just imagine? I mean, that was the way it made sense. It was like a whole. It was a community. It was caring. And even if the guys were really not really nice people, I never had anybody be hostile or threatening or anything. The nurses in Baltimore had been doing that for decades, and they knew we didn't have anything in our bag that they wanted. If they were looking for drugs, we didn't have any drugs. And they knew we were a rather pleasant bunch of people. And I probably half to 2/3 of the nurses were African American. And that had a part of it, that was part of it as well as the supervision. And when I negotiated the contract stuff, the supervisors were in the negotiating unit, so I was negotiating for the supervisors too. It was, crazy and good. It was all good.
well,
So, yeah, it's just, there are times within the whole career where I really felt empowered, and not just someone punching the time clock. Because they didn't have time clocks when I first started. We were treated like professionals, and we showed up and we did our job. And then at a certain point, they had a time study man following you around the unit, like timing your motions when you're taking apart the birthing bed.
right,
And timing charting. And then computerized charting came in where you check the boxes. And I would write creative writing, long narrative notes where you got a real feel for what was going on. And people would enjoy reading each other's notes.
right.
And then you get the check boxes because they are more efficient.
Efficiency.
Yeah. So we had the efficiency expert phase probably in the 90s.
Well, and
And then they cut, and then they cut, and then they cut, and they cut staff. And they come in with acuity levels. And so you have so many patients of so many acuity levels, and the computer tells you how many nurses you need to do the job. And if there are not enough patients, they send you home. And then more patients come in because, of course, people do go into labor whenever they go into labor. And then you're calling people to come in from home. And it's, anyhow, there you have a minute to like think during the day.
Well, and this,
Yeah,
I mean,
sorry,
like,
I interrupted you. I'm
no. This, I mean, like, because in a way, like, the tyranny of that, like, regime of efficiency, right? And when I use the word regime to kind of really stress
Yeah.
to people watching or listening to this that, like, it's an entire kind of way of arranging society, commerce, our jobs around that sort of principle of quote unquote efficiency, that we
Right.
are seeing now, like, the real costs of it. And that, like, kind of brings us to this kind of culminating point of, after the recession, Wisconsin, like every other state, was hurting. This, in a lot of ways, kind of propelled the rise of former Governor Scott Walker, who pushed through Act 10. It was all a piece of that, right? It was
Oh,
all
yeah.
a piece of that regime of efficiency, because it was also so shrouded in that language of, like, overbloated public school budgets that are going to teachers' pensions, a lot of quote unquote waste that needed to be eliminated. A lot of that same logic that has been used to cut nursing staffing hours, nursing support.
Right.
It all kind of culminated in this Act 10 that has left devastation, like, across the state. So I guess I just wanted
Yeah.
to hook it into that and ask
it's,
if you could talk about that.
It's, it's Taylorism, and then it's standardized testing and making the kids all fit into a certain model. And then they're putting in, because they're homeless children is the excuse, but they put in standardized curriculum where you all have to be at the same point at the same time. I mean, it's an assault. It's a continual assault. But in Wisconsin, before we had Walker, we had the Bradley Foundation, who are, like the Koch brothers. The Bradley Foundation are based here in Milwaukee, and they're a right-wing think tank, and they were for privatization of schools. And they were also, early on, dedicated to eliminating women's studies and African American studies and ethnic studies programs in universities, and cutting down humanities, and going back to the literary canon of 100 years ago. I mean, this is the people who are for privatization of schools. And so there were numerous groups that had funds to privatize education and to institute workfare. And Wisconsin was the poster child for retrogression. Wisconsin, which had been a progressive state in many ways, with lots of parks, Milwaukee that had socialist mayors. And there was literally, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there was a conspiracy here. It was a conspiracy to institute ALEC. The pre-written legislation fed to the Republican lawmakers to privatize everything. Just like every part of health departments had been privatized, they wanted to privatize the schools and privatize it down to the money going to, instead of public money going to private corporations, public money going to parochial schools, which had long been a goal of the right. And so we saw these private schools coming in. And what would happen is that Milwaukee public schools are funded according to who's in school on the first Friday. So there's a day after the beginning of the year, and students have all been recruited by shiny recruiters from private schools making wonderful promises with either really fancy names or really stupid names, some of them. And some of them in really fancy buildings and some of them in storefronts. And no quality assurance, no examination by the state, no standardized tests for them. And so you'd have students, parents because their child wasn't doing well in the MPS school necessarily, or just because they bought the ticket, the wolf ticket, is it? Mm-hmm. They bought the wolf ticket. And they start out at these private schools. These schools collect the money on the first Friday, and then these kids are booted out. Anybody who's disruptive, anybody who needs special education. And they show up at MPS and there's no funding. And so the public schools are robbed by the private schools. And this has been going on since there were private schools in Walker's day. And there are more and more private schools with more and more shiny promises. And there's still, it's not a pretty picture at all. So along with cutting all of the, we have a regime when they cut all of the environmental regulations so that mines could open and pour poisons into the rivers. So here we are. I'm a school nurse. I'm finally in the union. I know all the leaders of the union. They're people I've worked with on different political campaigns. I'm a known quantity. I was one of the people who had originally worked on the newspaper Rethinking Schools, together with the president of the union at the time. And all of these people who I worked with, they were the teacher of the year in Wisconsin at one point or another. They're fabulous teachers. One was as a parent, I helped to start the fraternity bilingual it's a fraternity school is in this neighborhood. It's two-way bilingual, multicultural elementary school, English and Spanish. The school board at the time had wanted to turn it into a reformatory for teachers who were messing up and have them work with a mentor and have our kids in this neighborhood be the guinea pigs, I will use guinea pigs once again, and have teachers who had problems. And that was the theme of the school. Well, our neighborhood, together with the Latinx community, fought the school board, and we won a school that's a model for wonderful bilingual education, and it's still excellent today. And so my younger child did his last 2 years of elementary school there. He had a speech impediment in English, but not in Spanish. So, whatever. So I had been involved in school politics before and as a parent, and fought against some of the behaviorist ways of conditioning children with rewards and punishments rather than celebrating their eagerness to learn within the school system. And wrote articles together with my children about the damage that kind of teaching does. So we were already known in the MPS community when I went and got hired, not by the nurses, but by the teachers union. And they were really happy to see me. So Act 10, also nurses were not very active in the union. Nurses had gone from being 20 people and supervisors to being over 100 people, 100 nurses. And the nurses who had been the itinerant nurses were very unhappy with the union because we had no pay scale. And despite belonging to the union paid no attention to the nurses. And one of the former organizers of the nurses of the MTEA, the teachers union, when I came aboard, when I asked her about this and we're trying to get nurses to join the union, she said to me, "Why should we bother? You're not going to be around very long." She's gone. So that was kind of how things came to begin. And so the nurses came together. We realized that it was the best job we could ever have. We got paid less than nurses in the hospital. We liked the schedule. A lot of people had children in school. We liked being on the school schedule, a lot of the younger people. But a lot of people became school nurses because they really believed in the kind of health care we were giving. And so Act 10 comes, and this old political organizer here, I'm in the teachers union, and the teachers union is getting attacked front and center.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first, I'm not like an insider to all of the parts of Act 10 and the legal battles and all of that. But it came down, and all I remember is that the students walked out in Madison from the Memorial of High School and West High School and East High School, and the high school students walked out with Act 10. Then the graduate student union walked out in Madison of University of Wisconsin. And then the teachers joined them. And then it's like, I got to get there.
Mm-hmm.
I got to get there, but I'm the nurse at that point at Riverside High School in the neighborhood here. And it's like, I call our union rep person. Can I get her, you're going to Madison, can I get a ride with you? And she just says, well, I'm already here. I called in sick. I'm already here. I'm in the Capitol. When are you coming? And so I'm like, you can't, as a nurse, you can't like not show up to work because you have kids who need medications or they will die or end up in the ER. You have kids, you have 100 asthmatics. You have 10 kids with cardiac conditions. You've got 6 diabetics. You have like 15 kids with seizure disorders in swimming class. You have like kids with anaphylaxis who die if they eat a peanut or near a peanut. And you've got the EpiPens. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a thing, you just can't be the person to say, I'm just not showing up. I got an attendance award over there. But the teachers called in sick. And at 5 a.m, I hear that the schools are closed, that there weren't teachers showing up. And so I call the head of the teachers union, who's in the neighborhood here, who's Bob Peterson, and I talked to his wife, who wrote the main research on the Bradley Foundation. Okay, people I know really well. And it's like, okay, I'm ready to go. Is anybody is anybody driving? Should I go with somebody? And Barbara says, Bob's been up all night. I think you should drive. I think you should go with him and make sure he stays awake. So I head over his house, and he's like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And I was like that too. And so we head out in his van, and I've got his cell phone, and he's arranging for, I'm fielding his calls while he's driving. And it's okay, we got to get a bullhorn. We got to get a bullhorn, and we got to get it to this place, whatever. So I show up there, and next to arrive is Riverside High School's marching band with the drum line. It was the drum line. Mm-hmm. And the drum line is there, and I have pictures and drawings of them showing up. And so the drum line led the teachers in marching around the Capitol. And so I call Connie, who's like the one who was there the night before. It's Connie, where are you? I'm marching around. She said, you got to come inside. You got to come inside. I'm by the statue. And it's like, what statue? There's statues all over the place at the Capitol. And it's like fighting Bob La Follette. Mm-hmm. And so I go in, and it's like mobs of people, and you're walking like two inches at a time. And you walk into the Capitol, and it's like the biggest wedding cake you've ever seen. It's like tier upon tier upon tier of roaring people wearing red, because it's like the color of University of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And the place is just, every inch is full. Every balcony is full. Every alcove is full. There are staircases coming down in every direction toward the center of the rotunda. Every staircase is full of people. And then I spot the school nurses. So I'm up there and I brought a banner, and it was just unbelievable. Unbelievable experience. And then I wander through the Capitol as the day goes by, and I see people that I've known ever since I moved to Wisconsin, and I haven't seen in 20 years. I mean, like, everybody I know is there. Mm-hmm. I mean, my kids' teachers are there. Kids who lived in Milwaukee and moved out and became farmers are there from like the western part of the state. There's Native American people there who are iron workers in regalia, in traditional regalia. There's workers from all these different unions, and that was just the beginning. And then it went on. It was February, and the temperature was like 20 degrees outside, and it would snow, and it would be freezing, and we'd be out around the Capitol for a couple of days, and then every weekend, month after month. And I've never experienced anything like that. I mean, it happened to some extent with the Vietnam War. When you'd go to like the grocery store, and there'd be like grandmas in front of the table and tabling in front of every grocery store all over town. And then when people would, like, you know, usually on college campuses, you give out an anti-war leaflet, and some guy would ball it up and throw it in your face, and it's, "I'm going to kill you, you commie." Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden everything changed. And at my school, for example, we got arrested for sitting in around the military recruiter table during the height of the draft, and we all got arrested. And when we came back, all the leaders of all the different student anti-war groups got arrested. The fraternity and sorority kids shut down the school in a strike against police coming onto campus, and there were 5,000 people waiting for us when we were released, and the campus was shut down. People went classroom to classroom and wrote that school is closed. Come out to greet the people who were arrested.
Wow.
When we were arrested initially, people sat in around the paddy wagon, and we couldn't move for 5 hours. And it was just, that's the only thing I could compare it to. You work and you work and you work, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, this really can happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm like, you know, I know I've kept you long enough, and I could honestly talk to you about this for days, literal days. But I mean, you know, I think that one thing I wanted to ask you, maybe by way of rounding out, and I genuinely can't thank you enough for talking to me about all of this. It's been a real honor listening to you. I mean, you know, I know that for something like the Wisconsin Uprising, which you were just describing, like, you know, for people who maybe forgotten about it or weren't paying attention at the time, I mean, it was the largest mass demonstration in Wisconsin, I think, in Wisconsin's history.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And until the next day when we broke the record again.
Right.
Like, it was that level of mobilization, of participation, of solidarity. And I think it's still, for those reasons, really like has an important place in everyone's hearts and their memories. Yeah. But obviously, you know, there are really hard parts about this story where, you know, the whether it's Walker, whether it's the, you know, Republicans in the legislature, whether it's the forces that arrayed to protect Walker in the recall election, there's so many other forces kind of at work that I think that it's easy for people to look back and say, well, the people mobilized at their best and it wasn't enough. And I don't want people to kind of leave this conversation thinking that.
Right.
So I wanted to kind of ask you, like, having been there, having seen that, and having a lot of your own activism in a long line of political commitment to compare it to, I guess what would be kind of your kind of takeaway thoughts for people who are reflecting 10 years after the passing of Act 10?
Well, the people who showed up are still out there. And there's a whole another generation of people who are angrier and more politically astute in many ways since that time. The powers that be are very powerful, and I think there were decisions that were made that helped the movement diffuse rather than continue. One of those was to rely on the electoral process rather than rely on ourselves. I felt that we should have continued to organize among the teachers and the MPS employees, and actually what I was planning to do together with some of the leadership of the union while the demonstrations were still going on that year was to come out with a weekly newspaper documenting what was going on in the struggle against Act 10, and to have like a fold-out center section that was a poster that was graphics and photos and inspirational that would hang in the teacher's break room in every school. We had several meetings to do that, and then the leadership dissolved that idea and didn't carry through. I was very disappointed, and then there were further splits over the way forward. And in the situation where I understand that the union leadership was going to have to organize a mechanism for people to rejoin the union every year independently, that your membership would expire, and also you couldn't do paycheck deduction for your union dues, and it would be like a constant, it took its toll. So they were in a situation of, I think, not wanting to advance and ask people to do more. And just being part of the union at that point was, they prayed it would happen. In the meantime, the privatization continues, and the campaign to make against the value of teachers is constant in Wisconsin. When I went for my COVID shot, there was another retired nurse there. And it was the first day that teachers were allowed to get the shot. And I started talking to her because she was a woman around my age. And she was like, she went into a tirade about the lazy teachers who are teaching remotely. And I'm like, okay, let's go back and start at the beginning. They're redoing all of the planning that they've ever done at this moment. They're working twice as hard. They're going to have to come back and deal with the repercussions of COVID. My husband taught freshman English, 3 college classes, and he worked about 80 hours a week grading. And he got paid like $20,000 a year for this. This is what it's like. How many more students these teachers have. The hundreds of students each teacher has. To know all of them. To direct his or her teaching to them. I mean, this is ridiculous. You are completely wrong. Haven't you ever been in a situation where you had way too many patients than you could take care of? And she ended up not being completely agreeing with me, but she was not arguing with me anymore. And she started reminiscing happily about her nursing career. And I told her about being a school nurse. So the propaganda is still out there. The schools are going to come out of COVID. They're going to continue being attacked. And I'm still a member of the union. And so what I do, as I do with different organizations, is I work as a volunteer and I don't make phone calls to candidates. I do what I do. And what it is I'll do artwork that says what I think. And it gets used by the teachers union, and it gets photographed lovingly by their media person, Joe Brusky, who's an incredible human being. And I work with people like John Fleissner. I work with Nicholas Lampert, who's in Just Seeds, who is working with the teachers union, doing artwork, and also we're part of Voces de la Frontera's art group, the immigrant rights Voces de los Artistas. And it's always a pleasure to see my artwork in the streets, saying what I want to say with lots of friends out there. So I know we're in a rough period. We got rid of you-know-who. The people who see what's truly going on, there are more of us. And the stacked deck is the gerrymandering, and the stacked deck is the money behind privatization of schools, and Betsy DeVos and all of the damage that she did. And meanwhile, there are advances made. We've made advances against the deportations of people. We're going to stop the separation of families. We're going to stop the pipelines going through indigenous territories. We're going to get a mining moratorium back in Wisconsin. And there are victories ahead. I think more people are aware of the lies than ever before. And as tragically global warming starts to have effects in this, all around the world, more than in the U.S., but in the U.S. too, people are going to realize that things really need to change. The priorities need to change. People's lives need to come first. And the concentration of the highest amount of wealth among fewer and fewer people, that system has to end. A lot of people know it's ridiculous and unjust. And it's got a long history of domination, and the domination within us of what you can do and what you can't do. And what the Act 10 demonstrations and the occupation of the Capitol showed is people who've never gone to a demonstration before will come to a demonstration, and they will continue, and it will change their life. And I've spoken to Native American veterans and Native American folks in their 40s who went to Standing Rock and who never thought of themselves as that kind of Native American, and never thought of themselves as somebody who would go and stand up against the police. And people who are veterans, who have fought in the U.S.'s wars and are changing what they think about what the U.S. does around the world. So there are many examples. But I am very fulfilled by the things I've done. I'm very, very lucky that I haven't gotten into a lot of trouble for them. But I always go at building allies and doing things together with people and not doing things that are foolish and individualistic. And I think that's the key to longevity, too, is to know that we're in this for the long haul, but also we're doing it together with wonderful people like all of you who are here tonight.